Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
And welcome back inside to Alex Garrett Podcasting. I know we do some sports, we do some adaptability, and we also do some politics, because I do believe that with sports, with adapting, we are also taxpayers. Athletes are taxpayers, people with disabilities are taxpayers, and so all of us have to worry about our taxes and where our money's being spent. Now, do I believe that a $3.1 trillion infrastructure plan is worth our taxpaying dollars? Hell no. And I think someone that agrees with me is Nick Loris. He's the Vice President of Policy for C3 Solutions, which is a conservative coalition for climate solutions. Nick, are taxpayer dollars going to be useful in this $3.1 trillion package? I want to start right there.
Yes, not by any means. I'm sure a few of them will, but when you start summing up that amount of money, it really just becomes monopoly money, and so much of that money is going to be spent on activities that aren't related to infrastructure. You're talking about universal pre-K. You're talking about huge spending initiatives on climate initiatives. You're talking about remaking the entire electricity grid with this program called the Clean Energy Payments Program. There's all sorts of policies here that would lead to a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse.
Absolutely. And I want to talk to you because you seem to be pinpointing Joe Manchin here. I feel like everybody is. DC Examiner article calling him the captain of the Senate. Why is he the pivotal person here? Why isn't the majority leader Schumer or even Minority McConnell? Why does it fall on his shoulders? And where do you see him going with all of this?
Yeah, to move through with the reconciliation package, you only need 51 votes. And with the Senate locked 50-50, Senator Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, has a lot of interest in protecting the energy sources in his state, primarily coal, but also natural gas. And he's also been one of kind of the traditional blue dog Democrats that's been concerned about the federal debt and the amount that we're passing on to our grandchildren that we're going to have to eventually pay down. And so he was on board with a 1.2 bipartisan infrastructure plan, but what you're seeing is a lot of the House Democrats want to package that $1.2 trillion infrastructure plan with a 3.5 reconciliation package. So the true price tag, if this all actually came together the way the Democrats wanted, would be $4.7 trillion. And he's simply saying that's too much. And he's worried about both the taxpayers, but also the energy consumers, not just in his state, but across the country.
Well, I want to talk about that because I think it's kind of interesting. I'm sure someone listening may be like, there's a coalition on the conservative side for climate solutions. I thought the conservatives hated climate change. But the reality is we all want solutions to this problem. So where does C3 fall on all of this? And what are the solutions that you guys have in mind?
Yeah, it's a great point. We certainly believe that the climate is changing, that man-made emissions are driving that warming, and that there are risks to climate change. And we want to reduce those risks through reducing greenhouse gas emissions and through helping to adapt to a changing climate through more resilient and reliable infrastructure. And, the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is not to raise the price of traditional energy sources, but to reduce the cost of new up-and-coming energy sources. And we've seen the cost of renewables fall dramatically. There's a lot of potential for small modular nuclear reactors. There's good policies that could lead to better forest management that would reduce the risk of wildfires, which is not only devastating to communities, but also spews a lot of CO2 and other pollutants into the atmosphere. So, we are really taking what we think is a pragmatic approach to the climate issue that will help accelerate innovation, that will reduce the cost of alternative energy sources, and that will make it more enticing for the rest of the world to pursue those alternative energy sources too, because we have to understand that this is a global problem. And
Nick, how do we go from how did Texas become the third most oil rich in the world? I mean, that's one of our states of the United States. third on that list, and I feel like they've dropped somewhat with the Biden policy, but how were they able to do that, and can we get more states on board like that doing the internal energy sources?
Yeah, it's really through competitive markets. The reason the United States has been an energy powerhouse, but also has been a global leader in greenhouse gas emissions reductions is through free enterprise and free competitive markets. And so, Texas is a huge oil and gas producer, but it's also a huge wind producer. If it was its own country, it would be the fifth largest wind producer in the world. And so we're seeing a lot of innovations happening in the energy sector. The fracking boom is the biggest contributor to reductions in emissions in the energy sector over the past 15 to 20 years, and yet it's kept energy prices reliable and affordable, and it's also created a whole lot of jobs in the process. And so there's a lot of good policies that can help accelerate that, and it can be a win for the economy and a win for the environment.
All right, you talk about affordable, you want to talk about great alternatives. See, I'm on the verge of saying, and I've always been a fan of fracking, and is that wrong to be a fan of fracking, or is that proven to be a successful, safe way to do things?
Yeah, it's proven to be a successful, safe way to do things. The process of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling really isn't anything new. It's something we've been doing really since the 50s and 60s. It's just that we've been able to really master it. And again, the biggest reason that we've displaced coal in our electricity mix about a decade ago, coal provided 50% of our electricity generation, and now that's down to 25%. And that's largely because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And again, if you look at the boom in all of the states and, the Pennsylvanias and the Texases and the North Dakotas of the world, they understand they want to protect their own environment and make sure it's done safely, but they also understand that it's a huge economic boon to these states and counties, and it's dramatically lowered the energy prices. So even if you're not in an energy-producing state, we're all reaping the benefits because of lower natural gas prices, lower electricity prices. I know prices at the pump are higher right now, but they would be even higher if we didn't have all of this domestic oil production.
All right, you talk about policy, and politicians are very funny when it comes to coal miners, aren't they? One minute they say, we love you guys. Next minute they say, we don't want you guys. So I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on the politicians' view on climate change? Do you feel like they literally change their own views as they're talking about this?
Yeah, they change their views. They change depending on which way the wind is blowing, and they also change based on which political interests they're representing. And all of this factors into climate policy that tends not to be good for the taxpayer. It tends not to be good for the energy consumer, but it also generally doesn't have the great impact of reducing emissions and actually meaning anything to reduce the risks of climate change. And we've seen policies like shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline, for instance, that would have transported oil from Canada down to Gulf Coast refineries. Now that we don't have that pipeline, we're moving more oil by rail car and by truck, which is more emissions intense than it carrying by pipeline. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences to these policies when they say they care about the environment or they care about climate change, but they don't necessarily think through all of the trade-offs that exist when they make these policy decisions and the unintended economic and environmental consequences of these decisions.
Do you guys look at the regulations? Obviously you do at C3 Solutions, but what I mean is, do you notice that it seems like they just want to tax everybody on the climate, to try and combat the climate? I feel like it's a tax-getting scheme rather than a climate-fixing scheme.
Yeah, it tends to be a revenue-making scheme and a money-making scheme, and they say they want the polluters to pay, but then it's these emissions emitters, whether that's an energy company or otherwise, that pass those costs on to consumers. And the reality is all that does is make people pay more for energy prices, and they don't really reduce their consumption all that much because we need energy every single day. And so I think you're exactly right, as these regulations and these taxes tend to simply just increase costs to the taxpayers, to energy consumers for negligible climate benefits. And that's why our model is really focused on accelerating innovation to make it in the self-interest of energy companies, of energy consumers to choose cheaper, cleaner alternatives. And I think that's the true way you'll get to a more sustainable and economically robust clean energy sector that ultimately does benefit the energy consumer and does make meaningful impacts in terms of reducing emissions.
Well, you do say that you have plans, so give us a little inside look. What is C3 Solutions really working on at the boardroom table, if you will?
Yeah, it's really a little bit of everything, to be honest with you, Alex, because I think the Biden approach to climate policy has been this whole of government approach. And we kind of flipped the script on that, and we really think of it as a whole of markets solution and approach. And so we want good tax policy, policy that is technology neutral across the board, but something like immediate expensing, which allows businesses to deduct their costs in the year that they're incurred rather than depreciate them over time. That's something that encourages investments in energy efficient technologies, in alternative energy sources. So good tax policy can lead to good economic and environmental outcomes. I mentioned wildfire management is certainly one. Clean free trade is something too. As you mentioned, we've been a leader in energy production, and we should be able to export that energy. We should be able to export those technologies overseas, and then really going after the regulatory apparatus that has obstructed all forms of clean energy development, as well as traditional energy development. It's very frustrating when you're trying to build a solar array or a small modular nuclear reactor, and you were just hamstrung in years of regulatory red tape or litigation. And so we want to make sure that these projects are safely built, of course, and we want to make sure that local communities are heard where these projects are being built. But at the same time, if we can't build anything here, whether that's a wind turbine or a new high-voltage transmission line, we're not going to make any meaningful progress in making any type of energy transition.
Well, I'm just thinking, with all these policy plans you guys have, do you have the ear of the politicians? Would you consider yourself lobbyists also? Do you try and get your thoughts into Washington's, vein?
Yeah, so we are, what's known as a 501c3. So we are, a public policy think tank. So we're not lobbyists. We consider ourselves policy educators. And we want to talk to both Republicans and Democrats, as well as people within the administration, and have been doing so, since C3 was founded just about a year ago. And we want to educate them on the policies that we think are good ideas and voice concerns about the policies we think are bad ideas. We don't fully endorse specific pieces of legislation because that dabbles into the idea of lobbying, but we certainly want to educate members of Congress and their staffers on what we think is the best path forward to a strong, healthy economy and a strong, healthy environment.
So, Joe Manchin, I'm going to tag you, Senator Manchin. If you listen to this, give them a call. They might want to talk to you about all of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to talk to Senator Manchin and his staff anytime. And, we're pleased that he's voicing a lot of the concerns that he is, both about the just egregious amount of taxpayer spending that would be entailed in the reconciliation package, but also good alternative path forward, because I know he cares about West Virginians in the country. He cares about taxpayers, but he also cares about the environment and climate change. And so he's can be a really good brand ambassador for all of these things and really how the movement and what public policy should look like.
All right. One thing that I really don't think is a myth, but people try and discredit is that they tax rainwater, that Democratic states tax rainwater because of the drainage and the Is that true? Is there some tax going on when you don't properly drain your house or the drainage system and whatnot?
There are regulations in place to make sure that streams and lakes and bodies of water aren't being polluted. So, it really depends on the situation. It's largely probably not the case, that there may be instances, one-off instances where it has occurred. But, if your home is kind of just operating normally, even under, some sort of heavy rainfall, it's highly doubtful that you would be taxed in any meaningful way.
All right, I've got to ask you this because I know this is around the time that President Biden did his speech yesterday. So when he says climate change is the existential threat, is the threat of the century, those type of things, he called it a confection point also. Do you agree with him? I've always thought terrorism would be first over climate change, but maybe at C3 Solutions you do see that as the existential threat. I'm not sure.
No. In fact, if you look at the main body of climate research, I think there's reason for optimism that the most extreme climate scenarios are becoming increasingly unlikely to become reality, partly because we've shifted off of coal in places like the United States. But these really doomsday climate scenarios, they are based on projections that are almost borderline impossible. It's based on low amounts of technology innovation, extremely high amounts of population growth, using every ounce of coal that we have on this planet. And that's not to dismiss the concerns of climate change. We certainly believe that there are risks to climate change, and even if we hit 3 degrees Celsius warming rather than 4 or 5, there are still going to be costs to the planet, and we want to mitigate and reduce those costs. But I worry that some of this climate catastrophism is, one, not based in the actual body of climate literature from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but it kind of scares people into situations that are unlikely to become true, and also kind of creates this defeatist attitude. I'm a climate optimist. I think we can really reduce those risks in a meaningful way because we have so much climate entrepreneurship in this country and around the world. And sometimes this doomsday messaging creates this defeatist attitude, and I don't think it's very helpful.
I was going to say, I feel like those into the climate may have seen it from the liberal side at first, then maybe have changed. What was your view, and why did you get into this, Nick?
Yeah, I honestly evolved on the issue myself. I thought there's a lot of natural variability in the climate. The climate's been changing, obviously for millions of years before humans even stepped foot on this planet. But then, you look at that mainstream body of literature that I said, and, climatologists, they do a really good job, especially with, some of this retrospective analysis as to how and why the climate's changed. And, we can't rely on climate models for everything, but at the same time, they can be a good parameter for where we may be heading. And just because there's uncertainty in the climate doesn't mean that's an excuse not to act. And so, I think it's been a combination of looking at the science, understanding public policy, making sure that we want to keep our economy strong and healthy, but also protect this planet for current and future generations. And so, I think all sorts of environmental policies are a worthy cause of taking on.
And why does it get so screwed up then? We all want to protect the climate, the environment, and God's, creation. I go that route too. But I just feel like on the left, it's so much more insane than those on the right. I mean, they want to do more than just protect. They want to sort of grab at it too, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit of my frustration too. Is if you don't take the most extreme position, you're somehow then not an environmentalist or a conservationist. And I grew up hiking and camping and love the outdoors and want to protect it again for future generations. But I sometimes think that my friends on the left fail to see what those trade-offs look like if we shut down all sorts of energy production, if we use trillions of dollars of taxpayer resources to pay for everything. And they also tend to ignore that this is a global issue. Right now China emits more than the rest of the developed world combined and accounts for more than a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so even if we reach net zero GHG by 2050, it would be really climatically meaningless. You're talking about a change in the Earth's temperature that would be almost too small to even measure. So sometimes I think, again, my friends on the left fail to kind of see the benefits and costs of some of their policies. And, and then it gets into, more picking winners and losers, more kind of cronyism and corporate welfare. A lot of the things that they rail against, especially corporate welfare, but some of their policies then tend to enable it.
Absolutely. All right. So a couple of thoughts here. Climate Accord, are we back in that? Are we back in the Paris Climate Accord?
We are back in the Paris Climate Accord. In fact, they do a yearly conference, and the next one's coming up in November. November, I believe it's 4th through 14th is the next climate conference. So right now it's non-binding, and there's no repercussions for failing to meet your climate targets as part of the Paris Climate Agreement, which most countries, because it's non-binding, that means they aren't meeting their targets, because it means hard decisions about taxes and regulations and subsidies. But we are back in it.
And we are paying the most in it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's President Biden mentioned yesterday that he wants to increase funding for it. Even more so, the target for that agreement was $100 billion per year, both in public spending but also private spending. And so far, the United States has been paying the lion's share.
Crazy. That just is crazy. And then the EPA, I mean, there was some talk about getting rid of it. I don't know. Is this a private sector issue more than a governmental agency issue to tackle?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both. And I think that there's a real good reason to devolve a lot of environmental protections and regulations down to the state and local level, because those are the people who are closest to the situation. And so they have the best understanding of, and they both understand the risks of inaction, but the liabilities environmentally of inaction. And so I think there's a lot of things we could devolve down to the state when it comes to an issue like climate change. Because it is a global issue, I do think that there's a role for the federal government. I think there's a role for the federal government to spend on research and development on a wide range of, chemistry and physics and basic sciences that could help create energy innovation, out of our, government national lab system. So I do think that there's a role. And I think that there's a role for the United States to play internationally as well. But I think global leadership, again, comes from demonstrating that free competitive markets have been a leader in emissions reduction, not policies focused on mandates, subsidies, and regulations.
All right. So COVID-19, did that change the climate? Did the climate cause COVID to spread? Is there any connection there?
Yeah, it really depends. I think that there's been some preliminary studies out there that have attributed the spread of COVID in certain areas, depending on temperature changes in certain areas. It's hard to attribute all of that to anthropogenic warming in just 1 year. I will say that we did see a significant amount of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the past year around the world, and that was largely because the world was shut down. And so I think it really speaks to how reliant we are on energy to power the global economy, and that's why I think we need to accelerate energy innovation, because that's not going to change anytime soon. And the cheaper we can make alternative forms of energy, the more we'll actually achieve those greenhouse gas emissions goals. So COVID, I think, taught us some lessons about climate change and may have had some influence on the spread, although I would argue that it was probably pretty marginal.
Well, and another thought on this is the labs. You just mentioned labs. And, I mean, to me, we have to monitor the labs closely. Do we not? I feel like we have to anyway. After this was released into the world, I feel like we have to monitor all kind of laboratories more closely.
Yeah, I think, always there's more opportunity for better transparency and proper oversight. I do think that the Department of Energy's national lab system is generally very good. Some of the smartest people in the world working on some really interesting issues, not just energy related, but health and, human welfare and, biology. So I understand wanting to give researchers a lot of autonomy in the research agendas they pursue, but at the same time, they are still using taxpayer dollars. So you certainly want more accountability and oversight for how that money is being spent and what they're doing.
Does C3 get into the lab? Does C3 Solutions get into the lab as well? Do you guys do experiments to figure all this out?
We don't. Our experimenting is putting pen to paper. We certainly talk to the labs. I've been out to 3 of the Department of Energy's national lab systems out west in the Northwest there. And, they do really, really incredible work. And that better informs our public policy discussions and the things that we write, So we like to visit, whether it's a wind farm or a solar array or an offshore oil rig or, going down deep into a coal mine. I've had the, good fortune to do all of those things. And again, talking to the people who work on these projects really humanizes what the public policy impact is going to be. And I think that's critically important, because you don't want to be in an ivory tower in D.C., telling people how they should live their lives or what should be done without truly talking to the people who this is going to impact. And climate policy is one that affects, all of us, again, both as energy consumers as well as taxpayers, but also because it's all of our planet. And we want to make sure that all 3 are taken into account.
All right. President Trump kind of had that same sentiment when he said these people in their air-conditioned offices are trying to rule all of us, and I kind of resonated with that. But with Trump, do you think he did okay with this, or did he have I think holding Saudi Arabia accountable was a big deal to all of this, wasn't it?
Yeah, I would say there were positives and negatives. I think the negatives were, dismissing the concerns of climate change, calling climate change a hoax in his Twitter thread, and then not really, going back on that in any meaningful way, but also understanding that, the U.S. is paying the lion's share. We want to hold other countries accountable, especially a country like China, which has lied about its greenhouse gas emissions reporting in the past. They are building, a coal-fired power plant every few days, and so there's so many problems with somebody like China, not to mention all the human rights abuses, and we need a leader to make sure we're staying strong on China. So overall, I would say that there was an important reform in terms of right-sizing some of the policies that had high costs and negligible environmental benefits. But at the same time, I think the messaging and some of the working relationships with the private sector, with states and communities could have been better too.
All right, how did China get up to the top of the list then? Because somehow they became the leader in all of this, even while every city they have has smog all over it, yet they're the leader in climate change? Someone explain that to me.
Yeah, exactly. They're not. I mean, they're the leader in greenhouse gas emissions. They're the leader in pollution and, soil degradation, poor water quality. They're the leader in just about every bad environmental metric that you would want to have. And I think that's very problematic. And I think it speaks to the nature of the way that they do things. It's not a free enterprise system that respects its citizens and private property rights. It's one where you have a central government building a lot of coal-fired power plants, even if they might not need all of them, and not worrying about pollution. Because, like you said, they're really dealing with smog as an issue, which also contributes to climate change. And we have the pollution control technologies to reduce smog. We have those scrubbers here in the United States on our coal-fired power plants, yet they just choose not to use them because they want to burn energy more cheaply. And it speaks to, again, their style of government versus, what we've seen here in the United States and the developed world, where you really do take environmental considerations and property rights into concern.
We have a minute and a half left. So in that minute and a half, I've got this question. What can the voters do to make sure these plans do not happen because of the costliness of them? What can the voters do?
Yeah, I really think that educating oneself and understanding what's in the package, which is a Herculean task, because when you're talking about spending $3.5 trillion, there's just so much being negotiated. So, really trying to get a grasp on what the federal government is actually trying to spend this money on is important, and then making an informed decision from there, because, we want voters and we want the general public to be active in policy and hearing their voices. I think district offices really understand that when their districts are being heard whether or not they think these policies are good ideas or bad ideas. So, anytime that the public can get involved in public policy from an education standpoint and from letting their voices be heard, will put pressure on members to make a decision one way or the other.
Will Manchin stand strong on this, or will he wilt?
That's a great question. Right now, I hate to make any type of prognostication because it usually means the opposite is going to happen. But, the way things are currently constructed, I think he would hold strong. It remains to be seen, if the Democrats, decide to bend towards him a little bit and reduce the dollar amount and maybe strip away some of these policies that would affect the oil, coal, and natural gas industry. So it really remains to be seen. But as things are currently constructed, I can't see him changing.
Okay, and as I'm thinking about this, is this a Green New Deal in disguise? I feel like people have been labeling this as that.
Probably not to that extent, but honestly, there's a lot there. Like I said, it would kind of reimagine our electricity grid with a number of carrots and sticks, and so utilities would be punished, but also subsidized, and so they're kind of buying into the idea and liking it, but ultimately those costs are going to be passed on to ratepayers, and it does have just about everything else, that AOC imagined into Green New Deal, from universal pre-K to a number of healthcare initiatives, and really everything in between. I don't think it's as top-down prescriptive as the Green New Deal, and granted that was just a concept and then a resolution, so we don't know what that have ultimately looked like, but there are a number of policies that really focus on just spending so much taxpayer money on entrenched special interests that would benefit in the energy industry and really not allow for free competitive markets to drive energy innovation forward.
All right. And so, Nick Loris, thanks so much. You're the VP of Policy at C3 Solutions. $1 million question. How can people find out about you and what you guys offer, and social media-wise as well? How can they find you?
Yeah, we are the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, 3csolutions.org. We also have a news mag, which is c3newsmag.org, where we aggregate a lot of great content and write some of our own too. Everything from op-eds that you'll see in the Hill and Forbes, and really any type of outlet that's writing about energy innovation and climate issues. And so please check us out there, because there's a lot of great content, not just from the in-house staff at C3, but also a lot of smart minds who are writing on this issue, and also a lot of smart minds who are doing something on this issue, because we really think these solutions that will be meaningful are bottom up, and there's a lot of great climate entrepreneurs there who are building and making really cool stuff that I think will have make a difference both economically and environmentally.
Well, there you go. And Nick, can we follow you as well?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is Economist Loris, and again, I write a lot for C3, but also other outlets. Please give me a follow, and would love to stay in touch and be helpful any way that I can.
Well, let's do this. When the plan, one way or another, comes out and there's a vote, let's have you back, all right? Would love to do that.
Yeah, happy to do so. That'd be great.
All right, Nick, thank you so much. And I'm Alex Garrett, where we're always adapting. We want to adapt as the climate's adapting to whatever it's going through. We want to be there to support our environment, but not tax everybody through the roof to do it, right? So that's where we stand on that. Alex Garrett Podcasting. We'll talk to you soon.